The Edwin Fox is very special. I believe it doesn't fully get the recognition it deserves. It's the last convict ship left in the world. It's the last wooden immigrant ship to bring immigrants to New Zealand. The Edwin Fox was built in India in 1853, made of teak, and it's now 161 years old. One of its first charters was the Crimean War. It took the troops out to fight in the Crimean and brought the injured soldiers back. But it's also did the convicts to Australia, took 279 convicts to Australia. It did 4 immigrant voyages with around 750 people on it to New Zealand. A lot of merchant shipping. It's been involved in the tea trade, the beer trade, but it's also carried even things like opium and whale oil. So you name it, this ship has done it. Of course, it arrived in Picton in the late 1800s and has been here ever since. At that stage, it was being used as a pioneering refrigeration ship for the lamb industry. These are the steerage class bunks that we've replicated here on board the ship to give people an idea of what conditions on board would have been like, especially for the steerage class passengers. Although at first sight it looks like there's plenty of room on these bunk beds for people, there was mum, dad and up to 4 children in 2 of these bunks. So 2 of these bunks would house 6 people for the duration of a 3-month voyage. So not a particularly pleasant experience. Often beds were wet through water getting down through the decks. There was only a small amount of cloth usually between you and a completely different family next to you. So living quarters were very close. Your luggage would be with you obviously next to your bunk, and then there would be the table that would come down through the middle of the ship, which would be where you ate. So you had a very small living space on board this ship throughout the voyage. This is an example of a first class cabin. As you can see, they have their own light, porthole and their own space essentially. However, they still did need to share a toilet. There wasn't very many of these cabins on board. It all depended on what the bookings were for the ship in this particular class. And then you have one more class above this, which was the saloon passengers, which had a very large cabin towards the back of the ship near where the captain would be. And they were able to deck that cabin out in their furniture that they were actually taking on board with them. This area is just showing you an example of some packing crates really. This is going to be soon converted into a kitchen area, so people will have a better idea of how they used to actually cook on board these ships. This area here is showing you that the clothes were dried along the centre of the ship, usually on lines that were hanging between posts. Obviously there was often wet clothes and wet washing on board, not least the bedding on board this ship. The hammocks, which are situated at the bow of the ship, is where traditionally the crew slept. The crew worked in a rotation of their shifts, so there was never enough hammocks for everybody. The ball and chain actually traditionally was not on board the Edwin Fox. It is actually on our ship just for fun at this stage. Our convicts were confined in small bunk-like cells. So the table on board the ship would go down the centre of the ship and obviously would relate usually to the bunks that were immediately in front of it as well. So that family that had those bunks would usually sit just in front of their bunks at the table, and that would be their space for the voyage. They would eat at this table, socialise at this table. I imagine just waste away time for those 3 months. The convicts, we believe, on the Edwin Fox did not see the light of day. There is a journal of a guard that was on this voyage that states how awfully he actually felt the conditions were for our convicts. They were basically confined below decks for nearly the entire 3-month voyage. It wasn't a pleasant trip for them at all. We had a lot of convicts on board which were very interesting characters. We had train robbers to very high profile cases that happened in London at the time as well. A lot of our convicts did very well for themselves actually once they got to Australia. However, a lot of them didn't do anywhere near the time that they were given. They were released on a ticket of leave into the community, and some were even given land in order to try and help the colony to grow in that area. So a lot of them actually did very well for themselves. As you can see on board, there's some examples of some lanterns, traditional style lanterns from this era. A lot of people would be confined below decks even on lovely beautiful days, especially if the wind was with the boat, because the crew would be very busy on the deck managing the sail. and it would be keeling over quite a lot as well. So a lot of people spent an awful lot of time with this type of lighting that you can see on board the ship now. Water on board the ship, fresh water was largely used obviously for drinking. That was rationed, so water for actually washing in was very rare. So you can imagine after 3 months the conditions on this boat, and the people on board were not particularly clean and hygienic. There was obviously a lot of illness on board this ship. One poor man died of a broken leg just because of the conditions being so bad. This ship was often quarantined before it came into port, up to 10 days off of Christchurch at one point, because it had fever on board as well. The winch that you see here has come off the Edwin Fox, and it's preserved now in its own little area with a roof on it in order so it doesn't deteriorate any further, but it's a great example of the winches that used to be on board these ships. So here we are down in the hull of the ship. You can see along here the scarf joints, which was a technique they used when they built these ships. It's very unique being on board the Edwin Fox and being able to walk around this ship. At present we don't get the visitor numbers to worry about the foot traffic that we have. We get around 7,000 visitors a year, so it makes for a unique experience being able to climb around in the hull of this ship. You can see the bilges here. There's lots of horrible things that have gone through these bilges over the years, but down in this area would usually be the store for some of the merchant shipping that it carried, the beer, tea, coffee, whale oil, opium even, and obviously other items. The mast here is actually made of cedar. Most of the ship here is actually teak. You'll see on this side that the stanchions have eroded away completely. This was due to it being sitting in Shakespeare Bay for 20 years with the weather and the tidal damage. On the other side you will see that the stanchions are intact somewhat, but have a metre or so's erosion over them, and this was actually to do with the angle of how this ship was sitting in Shakespeare Bay for 20 years, and it was the ingoing tide coming in and out for that length of time that has created this pattern. You can also see the shipworm that has been in the ship over the years as well. So down here in the dry dock you can see the ship from underneath. You'll see it has a very rounded bottom. Unfortunately this made for a boat that actually made people very seasick, but it was a real workhorse. It was nicknamed the tea tub and the booze barge, mainly because of its very rounded design. You'll see on the outside of the ship there's a metal here which is called Muntz metal. This was actually put on 15 years or so after it was originally built in order to prevent the shipworm from getting into it any further, because it had already got into the ship. This was done in London. It is actually peeling off quite badly on one side, but as you go around the ship on the other side you'll see it's much more preserved, and that is because this ship was lying on its side in Shakespeare Bay, and the mud actually preserved this side of the ship much better. At the bow of the ship here you can see where the billet head would have been. We do actually have the billet head. It's actually on display in the museum. It's now very fragile, hence why it is not on board the ship anymore. You can see the large nails that are protruding from the ship here in places. These were actually hammered, they were hand forged and hammered in hot in order to get a seal around these, around the nail. Contrary to what people may have thought, animals were not kept in the hold of the ship. They were actually on the decks above you. So you can imagine that what was washing down through those decks. Even though these decks are supposed to be waterproofed, obviously a lot of what they were depositing did come down through to the cabins. So you can understand now why the illness and nasty diseases actually went through this ship quite badly. A number of people over the years have died on board this ship from various different diseases. A lot of babies have actually been born on board as well. We've had Edwina foxes and we've even had Edwin foxes born on board. The steering wheel behind me is not the original steering wheel, unfortunately. The original steering wheel we did actually have in the 1960s, but it actually burnt in a fire whilst it was in storage. We do have the brass sleeve that goes over one of these tops of the midships part of the steering wheel. That's on display in the museum. But we're very lucky that a local woodworking group, a chap called Ron Perano and some friends got together and they recreated the wheel to the same size and dimensions and the same design as it would have been on board.